Good afternoon. It's afternoon. It's hard with no windows in here to remember where we are. Before we start, I'm going to share a little bit about myself, but I also like to know who's here. So raise your hand if you are in high school. All right, raise your hand if you are an undergraduate. Raise your hand if you're a graduate student. And raise your hand if you are older and wiser than that. All right, great. Great. I wanted to share a little bit more about who I am because it informs some of the things I want to say. And I'm going to start with my Twitter tagline, which is funny because I'm almost never on Twitter, but I think my Twitter tagline is pretty good. And it says that I'm the queen of the in-between places. I connect people, places, and things that should be together but aren't. And I use that tagline because throughout the course of my life, God has placed me in the in-between places. And I used to be really uncomfortable with that, but as I've gotten older, I realized that's where God wants me. And so I realized that's home, and I realized that's where my vocation is best served. So I grew up here in Washington, D.C., which is in between North and South. I am a lifelong Catholic, born and raised, but I went to Baptist school until I was in the 6th grade. And my grandmother left the Catholic Church right before I was born, and she started a church, so I also spent time in her church. And I grew up in a racially mixed neighborhood in the suburbs of D.C., but for high school, I went to Georgetown Visitation, which is the oldest all-girls Catholic school in the country, and predominantly white, and many of the students lived at a class level that was much higher than my middle-class family. So from a very early age, I had to figure out how to navigate these in-between places, and that can be hard when you're an adolescent and a teenager. But again, as I've gotten older and God keeps putting me in these places and I've reflected on that, I realize that there is a grace there and there's also an opportunity there. But I think it's important to note that my being in between is around my experiences and my existence. It's not necessarily around my values and my ideas. Sometimes when we talk about finding common ground or finding relatability, it's couched in a phrase that means we have to sacrifice our values and ideas, which is not necessarily what I'm saying. But I do think that some of our experiences put us in between the narratives or experiences of other people. So this panel is about polarization. And when we think about polarization, polarization is about the distance between our ideas, not the distance between our experiences. Because I have lived all over the country, I've traveled all over the world, and my experience tells me that no matter how different someone seems from you, our humanity is shared. And so if you dig deep enough, we can find common experience. But the polarization that we're observing in our country and in our world is really about living more in the distance between our ideas and less about the commonality of our experience as human beings, which is really what God intended for us. When I was preparing remarks for this panel, I was trying to think about examples to use, and I'm not a theologian, I don't work for a religious organization, and I was thinking about scripture, and I was thinking about my faith as a layperson, and I was having a really hard time. And then last weekend happened, and God was like, talk about that. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So just in case you were asleep last weekend, lots of things happened in D.C. There were 3 marches, and it's hard to keep track because in D.C. now we have a march like every 5 minutes, right? But there were 3 last weekend. There was the March for Life, there was the Indigenous Peoples March, and there was the Women's March. And then also last weekend, there was an incident on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which I think is really illustrative of the polarization that's happening in our country right now and how it's playing out. So I was praying about this, and I identified 3 key actions that I think would help us as Catholics confront polarization in our society, and I'm going to use last weekend as an example. The first one is around seeking truth. So how many people here have a social media account? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, something? Okay. On Saturday night, my social media feed blew up. So I had images of Confronting Catholic school students confronting a Native American person. I had images of all the various marches. On Sunday morning, like early in the morning, 7 a.m., a friend who's a journalist said, do you think your pastor is going to talk about what happened yesterday at the Lincoln Memorial? And then he wrote an article about it. Then another friend who's not Catholic, who's African American, found out later in the week, he said, well, there was this whole thing with like these black Hebrew Israelites, and they instigated the whole thing. And then another friend who's black but not Catholic, but went to an all-boys Catholic school in the Midwest, was tweeting at me, and then he says, no one's taking the black people's perspective, and I know what it's like to go to an all-boys school, and this is crazy. So my social media feed is blowing up, and I'm just trying to go to work and like make my breakfast so I don't get sleepy in the middle of the day, and I didn't reply. I didn't reply because I knew that this was complicated, as most things are, and I knew that I didn't have the time or the mental space or the emotional capacity to really seek truth in what was happening so that I could have an opinion that I wanted to share on the internet in perpetuity, right? So I didn't really look up what happened until Thursday night. So I went back to all the posts and the texts and the articles that my friends had written and the tweets, et cetera. And the main thing that I did was I found a 2-hour video that was posted by this fringe religious group who calls themselves Hebrew Israelites, African-American men. And it's a 2-hour video of their demonstration on the Lincoln Memorial. And it was really difficult to watch because they were very aggressive, and they came for everybody, right? So there was a black woman who was like, stop saying what you're saying, and they, berated her. Then there was like a Puerto Rican woman, there was a Native American woman, then there was a Catholic priest, then there were some black men, and there were some white families, and there were some tourists in MAGA hats and tourists not MAGA hats. They came for everybody for about an hour and a half until the confrontation that's now a public opinion. And then I watched some shorter videos. I watched from different perspectives, and it was really hard to watch because I think sometimes we get this snippet, and even though these Hebrew Israelites were being very, very toxic, they were talking about God, they were talking about repentance, and I was thinking about John the Baptist, and I was thinking, probably John the Baptist looked like this to some people when they walked by him. Now, I'm not saying that what they're saying is in the prophecy level of John the Baptist, absolutely at all. But I am saying that I think that even in the midst of like hatred, there's some truth. And so people take the pieces that they want and they relate to it. The Covenant students as well, they were kids. They were kids. No one in here raised their hand that they're in high school, but we all remember what it's like to be in high school. And it was just really difficult to watch all the different negative things that were being said. And so I want to say more about that in a second, but I want to talk about my second idea, which is to be discerning. So seek truth and then be discerning. I don't have the full truth because I wasn't there. I watched hours and hours of video. I read articles from various news outlets. I talked to friends. I don't have the full truth of what was there. But I do know that not only were people being insulted, but the church, our beloved church, was being insulted by the Hebrew Israelites. And some might say that the kids were defending the church, but I want to talk about threat and power. So in order to understand what's really a threat, we have to be discerning. We have to be discerning in the Holy Spirit. And so the Hebrew Israelites, I live in Ward 7 in Southeast DC. Hebrew Israelites tend to be in predominantly black neighborhoods, tend to be very aggressive all the time. They're a fringe group. Everybody acknowledges they're a fringe group. Even people who study hate groups in America acknowledge they're a fringe group. They're not really dangerous. They're not violent. And they're actually not a threat. But power is really key. And I think that when we think about actual threats, we have to think about, does this threat, does this hatred, does this vehemence have power behind it? And that's what we need to discern if we're going to confront true polarization. Because if we react to every negative or mean thing that happens, particularly as Christians, we'll burn ourselves out. And we won't actually be able to be the witness that Christ has called us to be, because we'll be so embroiled in all of the language around us. Many people pointed out that the young men were wearing MAGA hats. And, Donald Trump has said some things around the level of vehemence that these black men were saying on the video. And I'm not going to repeat some of the things that he said, but there have been things said about Mexican people, about Jews, about black people, about Native American people that are deeply troubling. And for me, the difference is that the president has power. Any president has power. And less than what Donald Trump has said is more the fact that in his administration, he has empowered people like Steve Bannon to make laws and enact policy. So when a person empowers someone who literally thinks that I am less of an important human being than Kim, and empowers that person to make policy, that is a threat to me. I don't know, and I don't believe that these young men wearing the hats necessarily believe that or want that to happen, and they probably aren't even aware of politics and power, because I don't know that I was at that age. But I do think that as Catholics, it's important to remember that when we are in a space to witness for the dignity of human life, like these young people were for the March for Life, but we wear a symbol that denounces the humanity of other people, then we invalidate our own witness. We invalidate our own witness. And so that doesn't mean that children should be taunted. I don't think that any children should be taunted by anyone. But I think that when we're discerning around how to respond as Catholics to polarization, that the most important response that we need to give is to people who have power to do things that contradict our Catholic social teaching and to do things that contradict our faith. And then the last thing, and then I'll wrap up, is the third pillar is to be consistent with our values but flexible on our ideology. So again, there were 3 marches. I was invited to all 3. I love and respect people who were a part of all 3, but they don't love and respect each other. Ideology is a system of ideas, typically that forms economic or political theory. But for me, the impact and experience of people transcends ideology. So for me, it's important to be clear about my values, and I'm not in the middle on my values. I think that life is sacred from conception till death. I'm really clear about my values. But when I talk to people who were at any of those 3 marches, and when I talk about ideologies that supersede the experiences of people in order to withhold to a set of rules and an ideology, that is where I challenge people, and that is where I am also challenged. And I think that our faith calls us to wrestle with that, to be really clear about our values as we've learned through our faith, through Catholic social teaching, through Scripture, through Christ. But to be willing to be flexible on our ideologies if we find that they are conflicting with the lived experience of people. So as I close, I just want to point out all of this is interior work. Seeking truth, being discerning, and holding to our values, that's interior work, because when we have to confront an incident like what happened at the Lincoln Memorial, we have to be prepared through our interior life. Each situation is unique. And I think that the person who best embodies how we confront polarization as a Catholic is the Native American elder, Nathan Phillips, who I don't think is Christian. He might be, but I don't know that he is. But when I was reading his remarks about what he did and why he did it, he was afraid. He willingly entered in the midst of polarization. And the chant that he was doing was a prayer. He said that it is a prayer. And his prayer did diffuse the situation. If you watch longer videos, you can actually see how energy in the situation shifted. And since then, he's offered to be in dialogue with whomever wants to be in dialogue with him. And I think that he embodies our mandate of radical love. As Christians, we're called to radical love. Love that baffles other people, that confuses other people, that makes them want to know how we come to love one another and others in this way. And we can only be prepared to do that if we tend to the interior work. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Janae. That was wonderful. I'm going to give you a spoiler alert right now, and that's that the way to overcome polarization is to make friends. And I'm so happy to be here with 3 friends of mine today. Janae, I've just known since we did an event on polarization last year. I've known Mitch and Robert for longer, but these are 3 of the people I would look to when I want to get something done in the church, when I want to build bridges across ideological lines. It's just a really important thing to look around the room and here today and begin to make friends. So thank you for having me, and thank you for having us here together. I work on this issue in my day job, where I help lead the initiative on Catholic social thought and public life at Georgetown, along with my colleague John Carr, and our colleague Anna Mislow is here with us today. Our goal is to bring Catholic principles to the conversations that matter. We want to encourage dialogue about how to pursue the common good through Catholic social thought. We want to build bridges across political, religious, and ideological lines. And we most of all want to encourage a new generation of Catholic young lay leaders to come up and step up and take responsibility to promote this kind of dialogue, and most importantly, to promote our principles in public life and bring these principles to these conversations that can affect the common good and help us move that conversation forward. In the last 5 years, our initiative has become a really important and unique place of this kind of conversation. We've had over 60 dialogues. We've had over 20,000 people come to our events, and many more watch on television, via C-SPAN, VR videos, et cetera. So if you're interested in this kind of a conversation, please follow the work of the initiative. And let me tell you a little bit about, just as an example, how John Carr and I met, because it's a story about friendship and overcoming polarization. I had just taken a job at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and was seen as kind of a center-right person, I would say. My background is as an attorney. I work on pro-life and religious liberty issues in the first part of my career. And John's background, I think, would be center-left, we would call it. He's worked on domestic policy for decades for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and others. And when I came on board at the conference, there were stories out there, the conference is leaning to the right and what have you, Kim Daniels, blah, blah, blah. And I got a phone call one day, right away, and it was John. And I had never met him before, and he said, "My name is John Carr. I want to say that I won't believe anything I read on the internet about you if you don't believe anything you read on the internet about me. How about we go out and have lunch?" And we did, and it was the beginning of a great friendship and a great work together to kind of try to build these bridges we're talking about. We don't shy away from hard issues, and that's one of the things that Janae talked about that I think is really important. It's not about a least common denominator Catholicism. It's not about watering down your beliefs, and it's not about stepping back and just talking about fuzzy, gauzy issues where everybody agrees. It's about taking those hard questions and doing what we do best as Catholics, bringing our faith and reason to them. And so we've done that through our Salt and Light gatherings and our Latino leadership gatherings and our dialogues. I've spent a lot of time thinking about polarization because of this work and because of a big gathering that we had last year in the spring where these folks were all involved as well. It was called The Many One: Overcoming Polarization, and we brought together 100 emerging and established Catholic leaders from around the country to work on this kind of a question. And so we had the Nuns on the Bus and the March for Life. We had National Review and Commonweal. We had Pax Christi, and we had the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We have a great selfie of Father Jim Martin and Robbie George with their arms around each other out on Twitter one of the nights of the conference. And it certainly was not beanbag, as they say. It wasn't just an easy, let's all just get along conversation. There were lots of challenging conversations, a lot of important work that got done. Nobody gave up on their beliefs. I'm sure you've all been around your parents, your grandparents' dinner tables where we, as Catholics, are used to arguing and standing up for ourselves, and we're all family at the end. And I think that's the way this conference went in my mind. We learned a couple lessons there, and I want to talk a little bit about those. And I would say the first is that we talked about following the lead of Pope Francis in this sense in particular, practicing mercy, living in charity, resisting ideological polarization. He's talked about that since the beginning of his pontificate. And one of the most important actions he took at the beginning, right, was the joint canonization of Pope John the 23rd and Pope John Paul II, excuse me. And in that story, you see two people who are seen as representatives of different poles of Catholic thought coming together. I wrote an article at the time with a friend of mine, John Gehring, talking about this as a symbol of what Catholics can bring to the conversation. And I wish I could say that our lucid prose and important arguments change people's minds. But of course, we're in a much more polarized situation today. And so it's all the more important for us to bring these lessons to the conversation. In these times, we have the divisive midterm elections that we just passed, right? In our church, we have the awful sexual abuse crisis that is further polarizing us. When you would think that around an issue like that, we would instead come together and work together. And obviously, we have situations like the ones that Janae talked about last weekend, where it seems like social media in particular is driving the kind of hostility and division and anger that we as Christians are called to stand against. And so what can we learn? What lessons can we draw from it? And the first I would say is that, as I said, we look to resist ideological polarization. We look to live in charity and mercy. The second is to look to young people. And in that regard, I really look to those of you here in the audience. When we were at our convening last June, we see that those of us who've been involved in conversations around these issues for a long time tend to get in our lanes, in our groove. We have the same arguments. We want to perform those same arguments. We want to debate and beat people we've been engaging with for a long time. Young people don't have those same commitments, those same histories, and those same kinds of relationships. And so it's really young people who are the future of moving past this kind of polarization. The second thing we learned is to diversify our leadership and diversify the voices that we listen to in the church. We really made an effort at our conference to bring together people who were not only of differing ages, but of different perspectives and backgrounds, because when you have people coming from different perspectives, you see the totality of the circumstances. I'll tell you the perspective I brought to this situation last week with the 3 marches and the Covington Catholic story. I looked at that on Twitter, on social media as well, and my first reaction was not from my professional role, frankly, but as a mother. I have teenage boys, and so I am intimately familiar with their lack of judgment. Sorry, guys. And but I'm also, I love them deeply and viscerally in a way that only a mother can, and that means I see them as particular people and not as stand-ins for anything. The other thing that being a mother has taught me is that not only are the people in front of me particular people with their strengths and weaknesses, but that I have a limit on my own perspective. That when I see a situation like that, I know that I come at it from this perspective as a mom of boys, but I also know that there are many perspectives in that conversation that I'm not as close to. The perspective of race, the perspective of class, the perspective of conflict that was there. So I recognize the limits of my own view as well. And both of those things led me not to jump in on social media at all. I don't think that it's ever important to be the first one in a story. I don't think there are very few of us whose jobs involve breaking news. And if that's not you, if that's not your job, I say that's a big lesson to take from that whole situation, is just to wait and take a breath and don't jump in, because it's so unlikely that you'll have a full view of the situation. Another lesson we took from this, of course, is that all of these efforts need to be rooted in prayer and the sacraments. We made sure that we had Mass every day. We made sure that confession was available. We began and ended with prayer. And as we left, when we heard people's responses about what they took from it, one of the things we heard again and again was how powerful it was to be walking up to communion with people who you had disagreed with over social media or in personal debates or just in writing over the years, to be walking up and to say that amen one after another after another. It really, really struck home with people. To be there, going to confession with people and realize that we're all broken and we all have our failings. That's frankly what most people took away, what most people wrote down afterwards. And so I think that that's an easy thing to say, but it's really important to remember how key it is. And finally, I would say that the importance of Catholic social teaching as a vehicle, as a tool for moving us past this polarization. One of the events that we had that night was a panel where we brought in outside perspectives, people who are not Catholic, but who might talk about what we could bring to the public conversation, which is also so divisive. One of those people was David Brooks, a New York Times columnist. And he says that the crisis we're facing today is a crisis of solidarity, that we're all individualized, we all stay in our own lanes, we all don't have the kind of relationships that we used to have. And because of this crisis, we need to figure out how to get past it. And he said Catholic social teaching is all we got in this country, not just for Catholics. Catholic social teaching is a way of thinking about community and solidarity and relationship and coming together. And in this country that's so divided and so angry, we here in this room are the people who can bring a respect for that and an understanding of that to the public conversation. And so it's using that resource and taking that teaching to public conversations that we can use to help overcome polarization outside and also overcome polarization within our own Catholic community. And finally, I want to look to Pope Francis because he's been talking this weekend in Panama about these very issues. He's spoken on the Way of the Cross. He's spoken to prisoners. And he said something that I think is important for us all to remember in situations like the heated one we had last weekend, and at any time you're trying to overcome polarization. And that's that we want to be a church that supports and accompanies, that is able to say, here I am, and that in the lives and amid the crosses of everyone who walks by our side. That's what I think we're looking for, is being that person who can recognize someone else's perspective, bring mercy, bring charity, bring a respect for our tradition of solidarity to the conversation, and hopefully add something to it. So thank you.
To talk about the political polarization of Catholics in the U.S., it's necessary to talk more broadly about the overall political polarization in the country. The reason for this is simple. Most American Catholics do not have Catholic worldviews. The primary reason for this is likely that many Catholics have little to no knowledge of Catholic social teaching, which is still the Church's best-kept secret, or the underlying philosophical and theological assumptions that shape it. As a result, many Americans let their political ideology or partisan identity shape their faith and political behavior, setting aside Christianity's radical countercultural demands. What is political polarization? There are two primary types of political polarization in our democracy. Polarization among elected officials and other political party elites, and polarization among the public or voters. High levels of polarization exist when a high percentage of officials or the public have non-centrist views coalescing around certain ideological poles. In our country right now, there are two main poles, liberal and conservative. Sometimes the term polarization is used when people are actually discussing partisanship. Partisanship is not focused on one's theoretical views or ideology, but on one's loyalty to his or her party. Polarization is also sometimes confused with acrimony or enmity across party or ideological lines. Polarization and partisanship can foster the use of harsh language and a growing number of bitter exchanges between Democrats and Republicans. But these are possible effects of polarization, not polarization itself. This is critical because some possible or proposed solutions to polarization, such as more polite behavior, are really more about reducing enmity than polarization, which has structural causes. We're currently experiencing high levels of both polarization and partisanship, both among the public and public officials, though polarization among the public is lower than it is among elites. For Catholics with a sincere commitment to Catholic social teaching, elite polarization is acutely problematic because neither major pole is aligned with church teaching. Both contemporary American conservatism and liberalism are rooted in an individualism that is incompatible with the church's understanding of the human person and community. As a result, contemporary liberalism's social libertarianism and conservatism's economic libertarianism are radically at odds with the Catholic commitment to the common good. Those who share the Church's pro-life, pro-social justice, communitarian approach are grossly underrepresented in Congress and among party leaders. As many U.S. Catholics take their cues from their ideology or their preferred political party, a great deal of dissent from church teaching exists on both the left and the right. Dissent on the left mirrors the dissent of others in the West, most notably in its support for legal access to abortion. Support for extreme free market beliefs and policies, meanwhile, is a far bigger problem in the U.S. than for Catholics anywhere else on the planet Earth. Both polarization and partisanship have grown tremendously in the past few decades. The ideological sorting of the parties has strengthened liberalism in the Democratic Party and conservatism in the GOP. At the same time, there's been a significant increase in the number of independent voters, with over 40% of the public identifying as independents, giving ideologues greater power in each of the parties. This process has been intensified by gerrymandering. The use of gerrymandering to create a very high percentage of safe seats that are not competitive in the general election has increased the ideological purity of the candidates. At the same time, something called geographic clustering has occurred, in which many people move to areas where their neighbors are more likely than not to share their values and lifestyle. Another key factor in rising polarization is the way campaigns are financed and the rising cost of getting elected. The dominant role played by special interest groups is the product of a system that gives the wealthy disproportionate influence. This is occurring at a time when economic inequality has exploded, and leading political scientists have found that widening economic inequality itself produces higher levels of polarization. Talk radio, cable news, and social media have also contributed to polarization. Many Americans are now in silos or bubbles, closed off from alternative perspectives and constantly being fed narratives that align with the interests of their party or ideology. The average Catholic is being shaped by all of these changes. Catholic institutions and media have also contributed to greater polarization, however. Like the secular press, the Catholic press is largely divided between left-wing and right-wing outlets. Middle-of-the-road Catholic outlets have sometimes engaged in both siderism, where all sides are treated as equally responsible, valid, and reasonable on the subject when they are not. Certain approaches to civility and dialogue, often facilitated by vocal opponents of polarization, are actually intensifying polarization by providing yet another forum to ideologues and failing to maximize the influence of Catholics that puts church teaching above their party or ideology. Both Catholic institutions and the press have also engaged in false balance, specifically allowing right-wing dissenters to claim they are orthodox and giving them a forum to distort and discreetly attack church teaching and spread their ideology. Until recent years, this is what polarization looked like in the US and how it divided American Catholics and distorted the faith. With the rise of Donald Trump, however, populist nationalism, another ideology deeply at odds with church teaching, has become increasingly important. One consequence has been the rise of what many are calling alt-Catholics and alt-Catholicism. Alt-Catholics claim orthodoxy while rejecting church teaching on a range of subjects which are often aligned with the positions held by the alt-right: anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bigotry, support for far-right strongmen, isolationism, sexism, sectarianism. So the church faces the problem of overcoming the big divide in American Catholicism between conservatives and liberals. It must now also contend with a small group of militant far-right dissenters who hate the Pope and distort and damage the church on a daily basis. Those hoping for a quick fix to the problem of Catholic polarization are out of luck. Reducing Catholic polarization will almost certainly require reducing overall political polarization in the country, a very difficult challenge. At the same time, the church can and should try to convince more U.S. Catholics to embrace Catholic ideals and support the countercultural approach of Catholic social teaching. Part of this will require reducing partisanship among Catholics. But if Catholics remain divided by party and polarization does not dramatically, it's important to consider how we might work to reduce acrimony and enmity between American Catholics across party and ideological lines. A primary consideration should be advocating for structural political reform. Campaign finance reform is essential for redemocratizing our system of government and reducing the power of economic elites. Redistricting reform can't make every race competitive, but it can reduce the behavior that has intensified polarization. Catholics should join a party and fight for a big tent approach within that party. At the same time, primary reform would help to reduce polarization by allowing independents to participate earlier in the process. Increasing access to the ballot would also create a more democratic system and likely help in reducing polarization. And if economic inequality increases polarization, working for greater social and economic justice will reduce it. Support for this type of structural political reform is vital, as these structural factors are critical in Catholic polarization. It's also essential for the Church to look inwardly and examine how we should behave toward our fellow Catholics and as a community. Step one in confronting Catholic political polarization should be to unite firmly against all forms of bigotry and those seeking to undermine our democratic system. We must not forget the lessons of the 1930s with the rise of fascism and allow brutal ideologies to become mainstream, creating a new pole, one more toxic and antithetical to Christian values than the existing ones. But we also need a positive vision for what the church in the U.S. should look like and the contribution we can make to the common good. There's no better approach to reducing Catholic polarization than in following Pope Francis's lead at all levels of the church. The U.S. bishops, individually and collectively, should embrace the Pope's agenda of ending the throwaway culture and replacing it with a culture of solidarity. Catholic leaders should try to rally everyday Catholics behind a whole-life approach that confronts the gravest threats to human life and dignity, both in our society and around the world. Those who follow the Pope's lead, incidentally, will be accused of furthering polarization by people from both sides for rejecting the status quo, yet it remains essential. A third essential element in confronting polarization is more responsible political engagement and discourse. On social media, the failure to check sources, show caution before spreading false information, and consider who is writing a post or article and why is pervasive, and it's got to stop. And we must refuse to promote those in any way who disseminate hate, nonsense, and false narratives that intensify polarization and enmity. Authentic dialogue can help to reduce partisanship, polarization, and hostility. Dialogue is possible when the desire for it is mutual and sincere, when we're open to listening, learning, and persuasion. There is no such thing as unilateral dialogue, though we should never treat anyone in a way that ignores their worth and dignity as a person. But this does not mean that one must engage in dialogue with everyone. Some forums, like social media, are not well suited for engaging in this type of dialogue, and it's perfectly okay to avoid certain conversations or to block people on social media if their tactics or dehumanizing views are causing distress or irritation. Finally, in evaluating politicians and their rhetoric, Catholics should be neither naive nor cynical. Some people argue that it's best to assume that everyone has good intentions, but they do not. And it's reckless as a citizen to assume that politicians have good intentions when their record shows otherwise, and it won't do anything to fix polarization. So since polarization will likely be around for a while, it's worth considering how we can reduce enmity and acrimony too. It's important to remember that Catholics without a Catholic worldview or who publicly dissent on hot-button issues are still Catholic. We should not want them to leave the church. We should want to persuade them to embrace a fully Catholic worldview, which is a lot easier if they do not feel like they're being pushed out of the church. Another way to reduce enmity, the enmity so often generated by polarization, is to love people with terrible political opinions. Don't let politics dominate everything. Don't try to create a bubble where we're only surrounded by those who meet exacting standards of wisdom and virtue. Finally, one critical way to reduce enmity is for American Catholics who are publicly dissenting from church teaching to be honest about their dissent. Catholics should not overstate their knowledge of church teaching or their commitment to it. They should not distort it intentionally or through neglect. Honesty will build trust.
Thanks to all of you. If you would take a look at your polarization bingo cards, they're all full. Now, I think we've done it. Between the three of it, we've got Covington, Talk Radio. I don't think we did Dubia. I don't think we did Integralism. We've got Alt-Right, Own the Libs. So we've heard a lot from all three. So I'm just going to try to land the plane here and give a few stories about kind of how do we do this? How do we go about this? And one thing is to remember that avoiding polarization, one way this was billed out at one point was confronting polarization, and I want to come back to that because that's an interesting way to put that. Avoiding polarization is not the same as not having the courage of our convictions as Catholics. And we've both, I think all three of you have mentioned that at some point. I'm reminded of a time, it was a couple years ago in the preparations for Pope Francis' visit to Philadelphia. I was working with a group to help prepare a group of local Philadelphians to be able to speak about their faith to the local news, to the media in preparation of that. and was on the train up to Philadelphia. And I sat down on the train, and a woman sat down next to me and asked why, where are you headed? And I said, I'm heading to Philadelphia to go do this, to prepare for the Pope Francis visit. She said, I'm Jewish, but I love this Pope Francis guy, and let me tell you why. And went off for 15 minutes, and it was fantastic. And then got off the train and into the cab, and the cab driver asked, where I was headed, and I said I was headed to the seminary where we were doing this training. He said, I'm Muslim, and I'm not sure about this Pope Francis, but let me tell you why. And for 15 minutes, unloaded on that. And that's not polarization. To be able to have an honest conversation, to be able to present yourself into those opportunities, to present your faith, as Catholics, that's what we're called to do, right? I mean, the most radical thing we can do is to continue to share that gospel message, continue to invoke Christ. And when I say radical, most people, when they think of radical, they think of something that is outside of ourselves or kind of an extenuating circumstance. Radical means root. That is what the most radical thing we can do at the core of who we are in our roots is to talk about Christ. And so don't fear about having the courage of your conviction to do that in whatever the context. The most important way to do that, obviously, is to get in the room with other people. A lot of what Kim has been up to with the initiative is really is fantastic in this front, as far as just getting people into the room, having conversations, building bridges. One place that is not good to do this, as we've heard 3 times already, is social media. It's just really, really tough to have a constructive conversation there. If you have to do it, you have to do it, and a lot of our generation, all of us here, you have to be on social media. Practical advice is to try to remember and try to go out of your way to find the humanity in a person you're about to address. There was this great story in the Washington Post just this weekend of Patton Oswalt, who is a comedian, would consider himself a kind of a liberal guy, got into a Twitter fight with someone over Trump and MAGA, and they were going back and forth. And then Patton Oswalt kind of dug deeper and found that this guy had a GoFundMe page because he had just come out of a diabetic coma and was emerging from this. And he sent out a tweet, said, man, you know what? This guy has been through a lot. Maybe we should just step back and be looking out for each other. I want to donate to his page. I think everyone should too. And now there's been, $30,000 to his GoFundMe page. They had a continuing conversation that continued on Twitter and then off of it. And I mean, what a great opportunity to do that. So to try to find the humanity in the person you're talking to on social media, I contend that probably the best place to do that is Instagram. As Catholics, we are after the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? And Twitter is a terrible place to find out what's true. And Facebook is a horrible place to find out what is good. But Instagram is still pretty good at the beauty part. I mean, it really is. It's the happiest place on the internet. If you were to go on any of our Twitter feeds, you'd find stuff that inspired you and stuff that infuriated you. And if you went to the Instagram feeds, you would find a ton of picture of Robert's kids. And he's like a great dad, and he's got lovely kids. I mean, you just get the humanity of people there. So go there first and remember that there are humans on the other side of this. One last thing here, and this is going back to the idea of confronting polarization. And I don't know if confronting is the right word. I think we need to remember that, as Janae and Kim both mentioned, we don't need to jump into these conversations right away. And that oftentimes prayer, oftentimes removing yourself from a situation is a powerful way to witness as a Catholic. I'm in the middle of a book that I would recommend to all of you by Cardinal Sarah here. It's called The Power of Silence Against the Dictatorship of Noise. How important is that? Even just the title there. I mean, just to be able to explore that idea of the power of silence. And he tells a story in there that's pertinent for us here in this room. It was back in 2011 during World Youth Day. And Pope Benedict was going up to address the crowds, and he had a speech all prepared. And it was one of these outdoor masses, 1 million people, and a huge storm hit. Huge storm hit, mud everywhere, rain. He didn't speak. They waited for the storm to subside. And as it ended and everyone's soaked and covered in mud, his assistant comes up and hands him the sheet of paper to begin his speech. And he says, no, let's just do adoration. Let's just pray. Let's continue this. And so he scrapped the speech, and 1 million Catholics prayed together after the storm. Like, what a beautiful idea, what a powerful thought for all of us to be constantly trying to pray during and after the storms. And I want to end with a quote from this book from Seurat, because I think it's very useful to us to be thinking about, how do we respond to an issue in Covington, and how do we confront these situations? And he says, confronted with evil, man gets organized by gathering the means necessary for his defense. His action is just, but sometimes it provokes greater evils. Our true grandeur lies in the humility of faith. The purer our belief, the more profound it is, and the closer it brings us to God, who is infinitely great. Silence and prayer are not a form of defection. They are the strongest weapon against evil. Man wants to do, but above all else, he must be. In silent prayer, man is fully human. He resembles David before Goliath. For prayer is the noblest, most sublime, and most vigorous act which elevates man to the level of God. I mean, what a beautiful sentiment. And so I would encourage all of you in all of your daily interactions, to pray, to be close to Christ, to not be afraid, to think and love and live as a Catholic first in those elements.
Thank you for each of you for sharing and really putting a human face to this notion of polarization. Ironically, talking about polarization can itself be polarizing. So thank you for entering into those waters with us. So this will begin our Q&A session. A few minutes. If anybody has any questions, we would ask you to line up over there. And Corey will start us off with a question for our panelists. Corey?
Well, I just want to say thank you again. That was just something that I needed to hear, and it was very helpful. And one of the things that came to mind, which was touched on a little bit, but as somebody who maybe is comfortable where I am or has been comfortable where I am and not taken steps to have dialogue and conversations, where would we begin to maybe even hear more of these kinds of talks, or the sources like the books that you presented? What kind of things could we practically use to help us enter into this kind of conversation?
So the question was, where can folks who might be with folks who think like them, who are very much like them, hear other perspectives and engage in that dialogue? So many of you are on campus in some capacity or another. When I was an undergraduate student, I intentionally would sign up for email listservs and go to meetings of student groups that I thought were opposed to my ideas and opposed to my thought. And not to provoke or question, but really just to listen, to try to better understand. I would caution against finding someone who you think is opposite to you and being like, can you be my friend? I mean, that doesn't, sometimes it works, but not if you don't really have the context. But I do think just intentionally putting yourself in spaces where ideas that are different from yours will be discussed can help you start to broaden your horizons, and you might make a friend.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'll say two things. I'm going to do one more plug for the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, because a lot of what we try to do is bring people together across these divides. So, for instance, we will have a Salt and Light event for young Catholic professionals that will bring together new members of Congress to talk about how their faith impacts their vocation. We will make a strong effort to have both Republicans and Democrats, to have women, men, different races. We want to bring different perspectives together, and that makes it challenging. We don't want to have an easy conversation. We want to have an interesting one. To my mind, being Catholic should be challenging. It's not about a walk in the park. So these are important conversations to have. So that's thing number one. Please come to our events. Thing number two, let me give a little bit of a shout out to Twitter here, since everybody's been picking on it. For me, in my education, Twitter has been a real resource because it has exposed me to resources that I would not have come across in my little bubble. So I read a set of publications religiously. I listened to people, read certain kind of books, etc. And I think that by filtering out the noise from my Twitter feed and by focusing on people who I respect and whose judgment I respect, and broadening the people that I listen to, I just have learned a ton, and I've been exposed to things that I never would have come across. So I think that doing that carefully is really important and can be very helpful.
Yeah, I would echo some of that. I didn't give my Twitter handle, Janae's. I don't use it much either, as is evident. But it is in, but not of DC. And all of us here are in Washington, so we're very lucky in the sense that there are a ton of rooms where these conversations are happening, that there are great resources that you can find online, and there are a ton of, just like this. And at the Initiative, which is doing great work at Georgetown. I work at the Catholic Information Center in D.C., which is right downtown, and we have dozens of events a year on these sorts of issues. So I encourage you to come check us out as well. The think tanks have free lunches. Go there and hear people out. Get the full story. Hear someone out for more than just one article or more than just a little snippet. But there really are a ton of resources here in town to avail yourself on issues, Catholic and political and otherwise.
Hello, my name is Nick. I'm a student at the University of Maryland. My question kind of relates to a brief personal experience that I had. I was interning the summer of 2017 with the bishops and with Migration and Refugee Services. And so this was like the first summer of the new administration and a lot of the, restrictive immigration policy. And I remember being it was a public open meeting with the Justice for Immigrants campaign. So you had Sister Simone, like Nuns on the Bus were there, like Jesuits. And we were talking about Pope Francis's Share the Journey campaign. And I remember everyone looking at me and asking me, just the intern, for like a young person's perspective. And I might have made a shady comment about the Fortnight for Freedom and kind of comparing it how our approach needs to be similar to that. And I was brought out of the room and I was told, be careful what you say in this building. And it was like a really troubling experience because I'm like, how can we as young people be a part of this dialogue if the hierarchy of the church wouldn't even allow it? And so how do we create that platform without going on Twitter where it gets even more of an echo chamber? So does my kind of question make sense? Okay.
I'll go because I don't work for a Catholic organization or publication. So I go to St. Augustine Parish, V Street Northwest, and when I joined the parish, I joined young adult ministry, and then I led young adult ministry, and I did a bunch of other things in my parish, and I just did what God told me to do. And through serving humbly in that way, I met Jonathan Lewis at the Archdiocese, who then invited me to larger platform issues, et cetera. And I say all that to say, I'm a layperson who can say whatever I want to say. And the platform through which I can say that has expanded solely because of my obedience to God. Not because I sought it, not because I desired it, not because I orchestrated it, but solely because of my obedience to God. And so I guess my advice is do what God tells you to do, and then when God gives you something important to say, God will give you the platform to say it. I think, working for our church, which is hierarchical, we do have to respect the hierarchy of the church, but I think that's where discernment comes in. So God may place us in the hierarchy of the church to do certain things, but God may also place us outside the hierarchy of the church to do and say certain things. And both of those are noble vocations. We just have to be obedient and listen for God's will.
That was great, and I agree completely with what Janae just said. And I want to talk as someone who has worked for church institutions, because I completely agree that first of all, that as lay people in particular, in the middle of this clerical sexual abuse crisis, we can see that we have a calling to step up and take our co-responsibility to be leaders in this church. And that doesn't necessarily mean a leadership position in the institutional church. It means finding where you are and taking the leadership there and using your experience, your perspective, your knowledge, and bringing that to public life as a Catholic. But the second thing I want to say is that I'm really sorry about the message you got, because I think that all of us who work in the church would say that our bishops bring so many different perspectives, and at their best bring an experience of leadership, an experience of closeness to the people that wants to work across the range of Catholic teaching and bring that to the public. So from religious liberty, as you mentioned, to immigration, two issues that I worked on there. And as a matter of fact, right after you were there, I came on board to help out with an immigration initiative. And the whole idea was to think how we could reach American Catholics who had voted and had responded to the immigration issue in the public square in a way that did not seem consonant with Catholic teaching. How do you reach those folks as Catholics? Well, the bishops had one response, but I have to say that, the person I think of as having the best response there in terms of leadership is Sister Norma Pimentel, who works for Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley and has become a real symbol of what it means to live and serve on that issue. And it's not about talk, it's about action. It's about who she is as a person. And that's, obviously, she's not a lay person, but she's bringing her experience and her perspective there, and I think it's really important. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. We do have one more quick question. We have time for one, so let you ask it.
Hi, my name's Sophie. I'm a student at American University, and you talked a lot about us as citizens or voters working to fix the polarization that we're seeing. But how do you suppose that we enact this change in our elected officials?
I'm going to give this one to Robert.
Well, I think that greater unity among Catholics at all levels, including the leadership, but including the hierarchy and the leadership, can help Catholics to act as a more unified voice and maybe create organizations that put pressure put pressure for political change. So, right now we're living in the second Gilded Age. And the proper response to that, I think, is a second progressive era. And progressives back in the early 20th century cut across both political parties, and there were independents. And they worked together not just for policy changes, but for structural political reform, so that the richest Americans couldn't dominate American politics. I think Catholic leadership on that can help to create, through new organizations and whatnot, that type of response so that we can re-democratize our system of government. And doing that alone will make it much easier for people that are center-right, that really care deeply about poverty and want to find real answers, and for people that are Democrats and are pro-life. Because right now, the way the system is set up, it's extremely grim. So there has to be an organized response to it.
One thing I would add is to think about who your elected officials are in a slightly different way, in that our elected officials are not just the president and senators and House of Representatives. What I can do to affect any one of those particular races is maybe slim to nothing. But as a young dad with kids beginning to go into school, I can give a lot of thought to who's in my school district, whether or not, who are those people? Who are your local representatives? That is something you can have a lot of effect on. It can make a very tangible difference in your life, in your community. So to know your elected officials is to more know than just knowing just the president or the senator, but to really know your community and get engaged at that level, because there's just a ton of opportunity there.
Thank you. And I'll just briefly add, I think part of what's contributing to polarization is thinking about single issues and people voting around single issues. And so I think, as Kim pointed out, Catholic social teaching is holistic and it's robust. And so if there's a politician who is in line with Catholic social teaching around one issue and opposed to Catholic social teaching on another, I think asking that question, raising the question, and asking provocative, interesting questions so that they are challenged to respond in the public sphere how they might consider other populations or other issues that they're not necessarily in line with Catholic social teaching on.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you so much.